What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my Jack-of-all-trades build for the achievement of the same name in Baldur's Gate 3. As I've been playing through the game, trying to do everything, and posting builds and videos about the playthroughs I've been experiencing, one of the more interesting ones was the Jack-of-all-trades achievement, or playing through the game and taking one level in every class as a build, which is for an achievement, but also just kind of an interesting way to play. And this build is going to go over my approach, as well as some of my reasoning behind these things, in what was ultimately a successful run. Now, that said, I do want to mention here at the beginning, if you are specifically trying to get this achievement, there is an easier way to do it. You can simply leave a companion unleveled until you get to the end of the game and then level them up all at once, as you cannot respec to get this achievement, but doing it this way will work. You can also get a hireling and do more or less the same thing. Both of those will get the achievement for you. However, that approach is, I would say, not really in keeping with the spirit of the challenge. And to that end, I actually live streamed every bit of this. If you're curious in seeing any individual aspect of this run, do check out those live streams for more details. However, with that in mind, I want to start this video with an overview, kind of talking about the general approach here and why I chose the classes that I did. My main thinking, which ultimately proved out to be mostly correct here, was that trying to focus on any one class feature was probably a waste of time, as we're only taking level 1 in each. So instead of that, I opted to go with dexterity and ranged weapons. This is because bows, longbows, crossbows, etc. all come with unique arrow types. These arrow types can provide unique effects, such as the standard fire arrow, or a darkness arrow that will put blind in an area, or say an arrow of roaring thunder, which can knock an enemy back on a failed save. All of those mechanics with those arrows are independent of any class you happen to be playing. It's really just whether or not you are decent at using a bow, which comes down to your dexterity ability score. Combined with a few other things we can focus on that will give us more damage and better attack rolls with this proved to be a very effective method. In fact, it really wasn't until towards the end of the game in Act 3 where I started being noticeably weaker than my party companions. However, besides just that, there were a few things in particular that we picked up class-wise very quickly, that is to say we picked certain classes early on to give us big bonuses right away to things that we need to get the run started properly. As the first few levels of this build, I would say, are more important than the vast majority of it. And on that note, before we move on a little bit, you do need to approach this on at least normal difficulty, as you cannot multi-class on story difficulty. Or Explorer, I believe it is called. But let's move the video on a little bit to character creation. Now, our goal in character creation is to create a character that has high dexterity and a decent amount of charisma so we can utilize our bow and talk our way out of pretty much any situation, which is going to help us out immensely. To this end, I actually picked human, not because of their incredible racial features or anything, but actually because of their human versatility feature that grants them an extra skill proficiency, as my goal was simply to have as many skill proficiencies as possible. Now, for our starting class, I decided on fighter. Arguably, you could also pick paladin, but I do think fighter is the better choice here. But we want to pick either fighter or paladin purely because they will start the game with a proficiency in almost everything. That includes heavy armor and all martial weapons, which includes pretty much all the weapons. However, fighter gets to pick a fighting style right at level 1, and we can pick archery. This is going to give us a +2 to our attack rolls with ranged weapons, which means we're more likely to hit, which can give us a pretty solid, decent bonus to the main thing we're going to be doing in combat right away. For our background, I went with criminal. This is purely because this will give us proficiency in deception and stealth, which will come up a few times. And then when it comes to our ability scores and proficiencies, this is where I actually made a little bit of a mistake in my live stream playthrough, because I took charisma to 15 and dexterity to 17, thinking that I might eventually be able to use the hag hair ability score improvement to even one of these out if I decided I wanted one more than another. However, that proved to be a waste of time. I would have been much better off in this instance just evening those out a little bit, which means the ideal spread here really would have been 12 strength, 16 dexterity, 14 constitution, 10 intelligence and wisdom, and 14 charisma. Combined with some items and bonuses we're going to get, this proved to be more than enough throughout the entire game. And since we won't be improving any of these because we're taking one level in every class, it's important to get these right. And if I could have changed anything about this run, that would have been one of the main ones. Now, proficiency-wise, this is actually pretty important. We want things like perception, deception, persuasion, and basically anything that's going to help us talk our way out of a situation. This is because when it comes to leveling up, one of the first levels we're going to take is Rogue, preferably at level 2. This is going to do a couple things for us, but the most important, I would argue, is that it's going to give us expertise, that is to say, an additional bonus to a couple of our skills. Namely, things like deception and persuasion, making us that much more likely to pass dialogue checks that are going to allow us to either skip combat entirely or take an easier route. And rogues also get sneak attack even right at level 1, and while we're only going to get a small amount of extra damage from this, it can prove useful for a build like this. Now, for level 3, while I didn't do this in the live stream, I would say one level class dip that proved exceptionally useful was a level of Cleric with the War Domain. This is specifically because War Domain gives us the ability to, if we hit an enemy, take an extra attack as a bonus action a couple of times per long rest. This effectively means that despite our very odd class formation here, we can still make multiple attacks in a round with our weapon, which means that particular level is pretty high value for us. But with the Cleric also being a spellcasting class, that brings us to probably the most interesting part of this build, because the individual levels after this point aren't going to matter as much as you might think. However, what I would recommend is picking up all of the spellcasting classes as quickly as possible from here. And this is because as a character with one level in every class, we are going to get 3rd level spell slots at maximum level. This is because our spell slots that are available to us are based off of our caster level, which is a combination of all of our casting classes put together. So while we'll only have one level in each casting class, those levels combine to form our spellcaster level, which grants us a few extra spell slots, which ultimately puts us at 3rd level spell slots at level 12. And those can be used for a variety of things, because while we won't have a lot of spells to go around or anything because of our 1 level class, we can use them on pretty strong general spells like Magic Missile, which is a guaranteed way to hit something, or potentially picking up Hellish Rebuke as a warlock, and then when you get hit, you can use that as a 3rd level spell to deal some damage back to an enemy. So basically, we can upcast some of our stronger level 1 spells to level 3 and get more use out of them than you might actually expect. Another thing to note about spellcasting with this build, though, is that cantrips in particular, that is to say Eldritch Blast, Firebolt, things like that, scale off of your character level, not your class level or anything. This means that stuff like Eldritch Blast is still going to get 3 rays at level 11, because that is what our character level is. So in certain instances, you can potentially make good use of that if you go into combat with the right mindset. So I would say those are the main things to keep in mind when you're leveling up, but honestly those first 3 or 4 levels by far wind up being the most important, as your approach likely isn't going to change with further classes at that point, even if it does give you a lot of options, such as the Paladin's Lay on Hands also being associated with character level, which can be a nice, useful heal throughout the game as well. So there's some little things like that, but that's the bulk of what I would say you need to know. Now we're going to move on to gear a little bit. Truth be told, you don't need a ton of gear to make this work, as our big emphasis is on talking and throwing those arrows. So while there aren't a ton of things we need, there are a few useful items I'd like to go over. First of all, as we started as a fighter, we can use heavy armor, and I would very much so advise you do so, because it's going to give us the best AC that we're going to get with this particular build. From there, though, we can pick up a pair of gloves of archery in the goblin camp right at the beginning of the game from the vendor there. That will give us some extra damage on our ranged weapon attacks. And while it's not much damage, pretty much anything is helpful here. Another really good item to help us talk our way out of situations is the Envoy's Amulet. We can get this by helping the Myconids in the Underdark with the quest that they have for us. This will be the reward for that. The Voice of the Circle action that this gives us access to grants us a bonus to some of our persuasion checks. But I would say by far the best and most important piece of equipment for this build is a crossbow you can get in Act 1 called Herald. You can get this by initially saving 2 members of the Zentarum from an attack by gnolls in the northern part of the map, and upon saving them, they will give you the location and directions to enter their secret hideout next to an area called Joaquin's Rest. However, it's important that you don't rob these 2 people after you save them, because otherwise you can't really get this bow, or at least not easily. So after doing this, go to Joaquin's Rest, find this secret area, talk to their leader who will then reward you with this bow. The reason this is so good, besides just doing a pretty solid amount of damage throughout the game, is actually the Heraldish Doom. When we attack a target with our ranged weapon, it has to succeed a charisma saving throw or be baned for 2 turns. Bane makes enemies take a penalty to their attack rolls and saving throws. So in addition to hitting things with all sorts of arrow-related effects, we can also debuff them at the same time. So while for the most part you kind of just want to use the best stuff you can find, Herald, I would say, is by far the most important piece of equipment we used for this. Now from there, I want to talk a little bit about combat and our approaches. As a reminder though, I live streamed this whole thing. If you want to see how I handled any particular thing, you can just look up the live stream. But a few notes on our general approach here. For starters, we have all those persuasion proficiencies and expertise related to them, so in a lot of instances, it's really helpful to just try to talk your way out of a situation rather than fight your way through it, because ultimately, while this build will do pretty well for the first 2 acts of the game, it really does start to fall off towards the end of the game where you're just getting out DPS'd by everything. But assuming talking your way out of a situation isn't possible, what I would advise you to do from there is look for ways to make the combat easier. This can be things like taking an enemy out by pushing them off a ledge with an arrow of roaring thunder or something, or finding ways to isolate and eliminate enemies on their own before taking them out as a group. Because in many ways, you're kind of running around with a 3.5 person party here. So it's really important to look for ways to overcome that sort of initial handicap. Because when it comes to actually being in combat, there's honestly not much for us to do outside of occasionally make a weapon attack, try to work in the rogue sneak attack where you can to get that extra bit of damage, and then the occasional spell cast that depends entirely on the situation. And while for the first couple parts of the game you should be able to keep up damage-wise because of those first few very useful items we get, you very quickly become the party's sort of weakest link in combat. So trying to maximize what damage you can do is pretty important. And to that end, there's a few ways we can go about doing that. Items that can help us sort of guarantee critical hits will actually help us deal a solid amount of damage, which certainly won't be amazing, but absolutely not terrible. And these can be things like the Illithid Power or Luck of the Far Realms, which can guarantee a critical, and a couple items in Act 2 that can also help you guarantee criticals by either paralyzing enemies or getting a killing blow and then making the next attack a critical. However, beyond those things, a lot of combat really comes down to your party composition, as you might imagine, as they're going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the later game. To that end, I found a very standard party composition to really help us round things out. Because our character, despite the sort of oddity with the heavy armor, is effectively playing the rogue character. That is to say, someone who's really great at talking, has proficiency in things like stealth, and the ability to attack from stealth with arrows and things to help us set the battlefield up. So for the rest of the party, I went with the standard fighter, cleric, wizard approach, which means Lae'zel, Shadowheart, and Gale if you don't want to respec anyone or hire a mercenary of some sort. Those 3 in general work really well together thanks to their base classes kind of meshing well for a party, especially since our character kind of fills in the roles that those characters do not. And if that wasn't enough information for you, again, I live streamed this entire thing. It might be better to show rather than tell here. However, I want to wrap this video up with a few of my general thoughts on this build and how it went, how I approached things, how it panned out, and I will say that this wound up being easier than I was expecting it to be. I think our character and the early class levels we took, even with a few mistakes that I corrected for the sake of this video, but very much so made in the live stream, proved nonetheless surprisingly effective. We really didn't start to notice a damage fall off until the last act of the game. And even here, you still have some options for helping your characters out by dealing with the low health enemies and letting other people focus the boss, things like that. So I guess what surprised me more than anything here was just how effective this build and approach wound up being. because while I certainly wouldn't recommend it, and it's far from being a top damage dealer or anything, it's also not completely useless, which is more or less what I was actually expecting. It was also really fun to see how the game interacts with a class like this, because we are taking all of these classes and you get the dialogue options for all of them. So weirdly enough, you wind up having a ton of options in dialogue, plus with all of our skills and things aimed at dialogue, we usually had a lot of options for approaching a given situation based on our classes and things like that, which resulted in a playthrough that was certainly unique, if not suboptimal. But all in all, more than anything, I would say the playthrough was in fact rather absurd. All of that said though, that is pretty much everything I've got for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed this video and the glimpse at how I approached this particular achievement run, and I'd certainly love to know if anybody else approaches it in this fashion instead of doing this achievement the easier ways. So let me know about that and what you think about the build, all of that stuff down in the comment section below as well, which means of course like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.